A lot of people would have been very surprised and probably pleased to imagine Austria-Hungary was considered a great power. So thank you. I'm allowed to thank you for that. And one thing I like to say at the beginning is that in case you think that I'm nostalgic for empire, I can assure you I'm not. But I am nostalgic for the future of this part of Europe that I expected to happen and that never came. So let me pose two difficult questions to start with. First, how much difference do we need to observe among groups of people to say that taken together, their society is multicultural in character? And I mean, it's annoying, but isn't every society multicultural in one way or another? And secondly, this is more important, what forms of difference matter at different historical moments? Historical circumstances, political possibilities, and administrative practices may each shape how some forms of difference come to matter at some times much more than other forms of difference. In Central Europe around 1900, language use and religion largely defined ideas of culture. Nationalist activists even claimed that different languages signified radically different cultures. They claimed that. That's all. Now, how did 19th century Austria, and I'm not giving you a map, and I'm not giving you a language map because those language maps are quite problematic. But how did 19th century Austria and Hungary seek to manage their multilingual, multi-confessional societies? In 1867, settlement had divided the former Austrian Empire into two separate states, which for the sake of convenience, I'll call Austria and Hungary because their real names take 10 minutes to say. The two states shared the same dynasty, the same military, the same foreign policy, and the same national debt. Their people used at least 11 languages and practiced at least 8 religions. No language, and this is very important, no language was spoken by a majority of citizens in Austria or Hungary, so there were no minorities. And people always talk about minorities in Austria-Hungary, but they're using a language of after 1918, which doesn't apply to the empire. More than 50%, however, were practicing Roman Catholics. Of course, 11 languages and 8 religions hardly reflects the full diversity of experience in this empire. Some languages, for example, were considered to be local dialects and not officially recognized, such as Yiddish or Moravian. The social profiles of the people who used the different languages also differed considerably in terms of wealth and educational level, both within the groups and between the groups of different language speakers. It would be hard, for example, to speak meaningfully of the Germans or the Czechs as somehow unitary groups, and people in those groups wouldn't have thought of themselves that way. Okay, Austria and Hungary governed their multilingual, multicultural societies in very different ways. What laws, institutions, and administrative practices did they create to manage the challenges? How did these practices work? What legacies did they leave after 1918? Well, we'll see how much I can get to in 10 minutes. By European standards, the Habsburg state was actually quite new. You think it's an ancient dynasty, but their state's one of the youngest in Europe. For centuries, the family had ruled over territories in Central and Eastern Europe, but they had no formal common name, no common laws or institutions. It wasn't until the 1740s when Archduchess, Queen, Empress, whatever you want to call her, Maria Theresa, worked to unify her very diverse territories by giving them common laws and ending regional privileges. And she did this really because of military necessity. Her son, the radical Emperor Joseph II, continued to integrate and unify, partly by creating a large bureaucracy staffed by the sons and later daughters of the educated middle classes. But not until 1804, in the face of Napoleonic aggression, did an emperor proclaim an actual Austrian empire. The Habsburgs were not the only dynasty to rule over linguistically diverse territories and peoples, and I often say today that scholars of Western Europe forget sometimes that linguistic diversity is not a pathological quality of the East, but we'll leave that aside. Diversity was understood back then in regional, historical, or social terms, not in terms of ethnic nationhood or even language use. For example, you probably know the elites used French and Italian. Maria Theresa, if you try to read her letters, they're often written in 3 or 4 languages. The Hungarian Diet, for example, communicated in Latin. Latin, after all, was no one's native language, so it served as a convenient administrative language for a region whose privileged classes used many languages. When Joseph II tried to impose German as a language of administration on Hungary in the 1780s, he didn't do it for nationalist reasons. It was because he believed that German was a more modern language than was Latin, and it could express the newer technological terms and ideas more easily than could a dead language. But of course, during the 19th century, linguistic differences came to be understood in ethnic terms. A final point about the earlier period. The Habsburgs always distinguished between communication with their citizens and communication within the bureaucracy. So even if Joseph II tried to impose German on the bureaucrats, he continued pragmatically to publish laws and ordinances in all the local languages. Now, in 1848, revolutions established constitutions and parliaments in Austria and in Hungary. In Austria, a parliament elected by a broad suffrage that included peasant deputies began to write a constitution. And that constitution declared that, quote, all nations, and the German word, and it's only the German word, is Volksstimme, all nations of the empire had equal rights, and each nationality had the inviolable right to preserve and care for its nationality in general and its language in particular, end quote. Language use defined nationality. And in deciding this law, basically what they were doing was taking the pragmatic practices of the Habsburgs and turning those into a constitutional right. Hungarians also declared a constitution, but one that was much less clear about the rights of non-Magyar language groups. Okay, the Habsburgs defeated the 1848 revolutions, but they did not deny the rights of language use that had been promoted by the revolutionaries. And after the ruler divided his empire into Austria and Hungary in 1867, the 2 new constitutions created references to diverse language use. Now, Austria and Hungary had very different constitutions, laws, administrations, everything. Hungary called itself a nation-state, but it was a nation-state in which Hungarian speakers comprised about 45% of the population. And at first, the Hungarian governments recognized that you could be part of the Hungarian nation, but speak another language. Later, the state promoted a more assimilationist policy of the kind we'll see in the 1920s and 1930s. It tried to use schools to remake the speakers of other languages into Hungarian speakers. By the 1880s, most other languages were forbidden from use in public institutions. This policy succeeded probably the most with Hungarian Jews, who abandoned German and Yiddish for Magyar. But 3 quick points. The Hungarian regime was happy to assimilate people of any ethnicity to the nation. There's no sense that ancestry or blood should determine who is Hungarian. 2, these policies provoked political opposition, of course, among educated members of the other language groups. And 3, education was so badly underfunded in Hungary that the aggressive assimilation policy lacked resources and never worked. Okay, now the Austrian state, which is a bit more interesting when it comes to managing linguistic diversity. Austria's institutions and practices are highly distinctive by European standards, I think even today. Austria's constitution adopted the 1848 rights to preserve nationality and language use, But the Austrians also got the right to schooling in their own language and the right to address the local bureaucracy in their own language, which is a big thing. No Austrian should be educated in a language not his or her own. And in 1869, the Austrian government actually established, and more importantly, fully paid for, a mandatory 8-year public school system for all boys and girls. Austria, by the way, produced a literacy rate comparable to that of France. Austria created a special high court to hear cases brought by citizens who claimed that state officials had violated their rights. German did remain the language of the imperial bureaucracy, but not of the regional bureaucracies, and German was also the language of military command. Austrian law sought to establish equality for individuals and to diminish the possibility of conflict in society by establishing clear rights. And ironically, the Austrians produced both positive and negative outcomes. The law did equalize rights, and over the years, the court decisions expanded those rights. But these guarantees unintentionally created new sites for conflict, precisely over language use. The constitutional promises were so general that they created possibilities for politicians, entrepreneurs, to make new claims on the state. So, for example, did the law guarantee only equality in primary schooling? What about secondary schools? What about universities? And what about street signs, the languages used by conductors on trains or in train stations? Should local officials be required to know both regional languages, even if local people only spoke one of them? I'm so sorry for the complications. It's typical. Austrian politics became consumed, as you probably know, by conflicting nationalist demands. And electoral reform aggravated this trend as politicians competed for the new voters by making more and more radical demands. But I just want to stress, these conflicts were political in nature. They were not conflicts between or among populations, but between politicians. Historians used to believe that political conflict in Austria reflected conflict among nations. Now we understand, and Austria was doomed because it had so many nations that were conflicting. Later, nationalists referred to Austria as the prison of the peoples. But more recently, we now use the concept of national indifference to disprove all of this. And studies of communities where people used more than one language show that in daily life, language use didn't necessarily determine self-identification. Religion was always a much better predictor of community, and many people used more than one language in daily life, something that statisticians and historians always forget. Unintentionally, the government also contributed to nationalist conflict because it began to ask in the census that respondents proclaim their language of daily use. And this statistic was important for determining how many schools in which languages and how many officials in which languages. But of course, nationalist activists used this as a moment where people should proclaim their national loyalty. Also in Austria, and this is super crucial, you could choose to report a different language in different censuses. People often did this. One year they'd say that this is their language. 10 years later they'd say this is their language. And you could choose to send your child to a different language school in different years, which people often did for reasons of social mobility. National belonging was never legally fixed in Austria. And nationalist activists complained regularly about that. In 1918, the empire vanished, not because of nationalist conflict, but because of a lost war. The states that replaced it liked to call themselves nation states, although, like 19th century Hungary, they were anything but that. Now that they controlled the governments, nationalists built on their experience in the empire and used imperial laws and personnel to make national belonging something that was fixed and an unchangeable part of citizenship. They used the popular concept of national self-determination to give rights to groups rather than to individual citizens, while still proclaiming themselves democratic. People could no longer choose, by the way, what language to proclaim on the census or what schools to send their children to. Instead, the governments instituted investigations to measure the authentic nationhood of someone whose national identity seemed questionable. Giving the wrong answer about language or nationality on the census could bring you a fine or even a short term in jail, even in Czechoslovakia, the most liberal of the successor states. I have another page, but I won't say it. I'll simply say that if you ask me what worked in Imperial Austria, I would say local societies, well-intentioned top-down reform tried to bring equality to individual citizens, but unintentionally promoted entrepreneurs of national group identification who fought each other and created this idea of national conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. Sometimes people joke about the Balkans, that they pretend to be different cultures and nationalities. If you look at the old imperial map and sort of see the voting patterns today, you can see a very, very clear line in the sort of gerrymandering where people who used to be in the empire vote in a very specific way that is correlated and differs from the population of the new the new nations. Why is this?
Well, I would answer that by saying that the part I didn't get to say is that all these successor states reject the idea of empire and reject that their societies were part of empire and that their societies benefited or participated in empire. So, but in fact, we can't deny the long-term experience of these institutions and these commonalities. And I think it's not surprising that today, even after 100 years, those commonalities are still evident in voting maps. They're also evident because people in regions seize upon their place in empire as a way to fight against central governments today. So sometimes when local people want to distance themselves from central government, they will hold on to those old empire kind of identifications. So there's a lot of reasons, but it's, I don't think, surprising that we see that.
Interesting, thank you.